It's been a while since I've done a conversation episode on the Sons of Men podcast, and today I'm really excited to have someone in my home. My guest today is someone that I've known for roughly 45 years, and I don't quite remember meeting this guest, though he probably remembers it better than I do. He has been here for a couple of days. We've spent some time together as a family, playing games and getting caught up. And this next guest is Dennis, my father. I'm really happy to have you here today, Dad. I think people are gonna really enjoy this episode, and it's such an interesting idea, father and son talking with the topic of the Sons of Men podcast. I'm already going to caveat I'm probably going to get emotional during this one, so that is a fair warning. I do get emotional in my other podcast just by myself, but Dad, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being open and willing to do this today.
Well, thank you. It is a privilege, for sure. And we've had a good couple of days visiting and catching up, which is great. One of our goals was to come and, of course, continue our relationship face to face. But we've always liked to see where our children live and where they've placed their roots for the time anyway. And so we wanted to see their home in Vancouver. And since they've moved back from somewhere else. And so it's been a privilege. Thanks.
Yeah, well, we also were able to have you in Sweden for the wedding, which was really great.
Yeah.
That you got to see our home there and meet all of our friends. And yeah, now you've been able to come here to Vancouver and see, again, another one of our many stops along the journey of life.
Yeah.
I found a quote, and this is it seems a bit dour, but this is a quote from a musician named Nick Cave, who is an Australian songwriter and filmmaker. He was quite known in his early days as he's a pretty rough guy, and his lyrics were pretty rough. He talked about some pretty dark things when it came to the human condition, but he was a great poet. And then he became a father. It was interesting to see the trajectory of his life even after that, to see his perspective change. And then he lost his son at a young age, and he's been writing a lot about it since then. It's pretty harrowing stuff, and I think the quote is really beautiful. And we're not going to just talk about suffering today. I know that's my favorite topic, but I just think it's an interesting, as a man that I really look up to as a writer. I think you'll find it interesting. So someone had reached out to him and asked. He has an open letter that he writes to fans who ask him deep questions about life. And somebody had lost their dad and had written him asking about the loss of his son. And do you feel him around? Now that he's gone. And of course, Nick Cave is a writer, so he has a very eloquent way to say it. But he says, "It seems to me that if we love, we grieve. That's the deal. That's the pact. Grief and love are forever intertwined. Grief is the terrible reminder of the depths of our love, and, like love, grief is non-negotiable." It's a bit of a heavy one, but I think it's interesting how it was clear love really changed Nick Cave's perspective on the world. You could see this really impacted his perspective. And we've been talking about, even this weekend while you've been here, about the idea of love and how when we use that word, it doesn't really mean what it's supposed to. Can you just, first of all, what do you think about this quote?
Absolutely true. If you love someone and they pass from off the scene of the earth, you will grieve. Absolutely true. I've experienced that many times now, given where I am in my stage of life, where friends have passed away. My parents have passed away. Others whom I knew who were close have passed, and there's no escaping the grief. The only thing is, we don't have to. I don't think we don't have to grieve without hope of peace and even joy on the other side of the grieving process. Now, when I say the other side, I don't mean that. In one sense, the loss will be felt, will continue to be felt, but the edge of it, by edge I mean the edge of the pain, tails off a bit, and even in the midst of that, you still experience joy and hope and future anticipation of what might be in store. So that can also be part of the human condition in the process of love and grief.
You said something we visited you guys from Sweden. I think it was 2 years into living in Sweden. You guys were celebrating your wedding anniversary, and we'd come back for that. Also, your mom's and your birthday as well. And you said something that I tell people about all the time, which was really inspiring to me. You said that you had married mom over and over again, numerous times over the course of your relationship, and I think that speaks to the love you want people to think of when we talk about the word love. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Oh boy. I remember saying it. I don't know what exactly I had in mind when I said it, but I think I have an idea. Well, because if you're in a long relationship with somebody, like I am with my wife, we've been married 52 years. We started off very young, and we always say we grew up after we were married, and to a large extent we did. And so as you mature, you get to know each other better, and you actually start to really feel differently about the other person. And it's like you're, in one sense, starting over again, since you've learned something you didn't know. It might have been 5. I don't remember the exact details, but of when you come to these sort of watershed moments in your marriage, where you realize something about your partner that you never realized before, and it's like starting over again. And so then you move from that, you work through that situation, and you move on really to the next one that'll happen. And sometimes it's not even that dramatic. It would be more incremental, but you it's part of learning to really know the person that, in my case, is the closest to me relationally.
Yeah, it's not a feeling, not just a feeling.
No. Well, it includes feelings for sure. I mean, emotions are involved, but it's learning, progressing in your maturity, I'd say. Learning things that are important along the way that you didn't. And it's not always just in regards to the marriage. It's through that incident in marriage where you're affected throughout the whole of your being because of what you've learned. Marriage in that case is a medium, even though it also improves the marriage itself, right? So yeah. It's a medium to life growth as well as a person.
Yeah, I think you defined clearly what I really appreciated about that statement. And actually it was something that we took back to Canada, or back to Sweden, because we got married that summer. That same year you guys celebrated your 50th, which was pretty special.
Yeah, it was a pretty full summer.
It was very tiring, but it was a beautiful time. I want to, I know you, but I think it's important for other people out there now listening to get to know you better. I know some of you, what your life was in the early years, where you grew up and the community that you grew up in. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like in your life when you were just even a young boy? Do you have a lot of memories from that time? Where did you grow up, and what was the conditions or the circumstances of your growing up?
I have a lot of memories, actually, of my growing up years. It seems when you get to be my age, you remember the past better and you remember the what happened 2 days ago. But yeah, I have a lot of memories, and most of them from in the early years are very positive memories. Um, I grew up in a Mennonite community at a time when the Mennonite communities were still very integrated together as communities. It was the time before the this group of people started to spread out into the wider society um, to a much greater extent than was the case at the beginning. So I still grew up in this sort of um, uh, tribe, you might say, of people who all more or less thought the same way, and it was highly faith based. There was even though there were deviations within the community as it regards individual people and their actual faith, but it was a faith-based community, and so God was very much at the center of it. But it was an agricultural community, of course, because the Mennonites were farmers, and so there was a lot of actual physical work surrounding life. Life was working hard. And as a child, I grew up working hard. It was expected. From a very early age, 9, 10 years old, you had very specific duties that were yours to do. Um, uh, most days you had chores. And as men, is also fairly patriarchal. So, or roles were distinctive for men and women. So the guys, most of the time, our chores involved things outside, winter and summer, milking cows, looking after animals outside in the winter, all year round. In the summer, it included working in the fields and helping Dad with transporting seed or even running machines. I started running machines at a very young age. 12 years old, I was running a machine. So life really revolved a lot around the work, because it was the family worked together to operate the enterprise, even though it was in the context of other families doing the same thing, and often that we would work together as a community doing things when there wasn't enough, on jobs that required larger man force, right? So that was also part of it. And I remember very positive as a kid, every winter we got together as a community to build an ice rink so we could skate and play hockey. And there was a community effort. Everybody sort of had, everybody sort of had their place even in that, in terms of what their role would be, depending on their expertise or whatever. It wasn't huge expertise involved, but yeah, there was still that. So there's good memories like that. I lived my immediate family lived just down the road from my grandparents. So, and I was often at my grandparents because my grandfather basically set up his kids to farm, like all families were like that. The father would provide assets for his kids, his children, to also do the same thing, farm. Yeah, so that was the context, and of course, church life was very much a part of it as well. So Sundays were days of rest and worship, and that was very much a part of the whole lifestyle as well. There was in both the daily the days of work in the community, and then the day of worship, there was often conflict between people as well that had to be worked out.
And that was done as a community, like elders, or how did that
Yeah,
work?
there were elders in the church, but in terms of our, if we go back to the work side of things, the 6 days a week, usually those were reconciled within the family. You know, my grandfather, and it was my mother's father. My dad's father actually lived in another community, another Mennonite community. So the work side of the whole operation was really my mother's family, where my father came over and married my mother, and then became a part of my mother's agricultural family, if you will, my mother's family. And so it was in that family then that conflicts needed to be worked out. And sometimes over the years, they weren't worked out very well. And so there was this tension. Some of the tension remained in some cases, but in most cases, you would reconcile in the family. And then as a larger community, if we move now to the faith side of life, then it would be conflicts were resolved within the church family. And as time went on, not everybody in my community remained with the particular church that was operational within our community. Sometimes conflicts pushed people out, or they decided to move out of that particular church family and move to the Mennonite church in the next community, right? So there was some shifting that way as well. But generally, conflicts were resolved often, if necessary, publicly in the church community. I remember times on a Sunday morning when there was conflict between two families, and over a particular issue, it became very public because all the private stuff trying to resolve it privately had failed, and then it came to the full community to resolve the issue of a conflict between two families. And it was, as a kid, I remember watching that and thinking, this is awkward. Felt really awkward. But pretty much the whole service was taken up with this issue. But at the end, there were tears and repentance and forgiveness in that case. Wasn't always the case, but many times it was. And so there was resolve right within the community to solve the problem.
This brings up, just popped into my head. I've heard you talk about all this stuff before, like not this in particular, but generally how you grew up. And you were in a very insular world. Yeah. Because I know eventually you went to a high school outside of your town.
Yeah.
What was that like, to leave that insular community to go to a place that is not part, that must have been scary or strange or what?
Yeah, we had a school, like the Mennonites lived in villages.
Yeah.
And then the farmland was around the villages, right? So we had a school right in the center of our village, and it was a public school. It wasn't a private religious school. It was a public school. The Mennonites had to resolve that issue years before I was born, because they actually had their own education as settlers. They had their own educational system. I would say, from a intellectual point of view, or from the national, it wasn't as good as a public school in terms of the education it offered. But they did. They taught the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. Plus, of course, it was highly faith-based, so it was religious as well. But they had to resolve the issue of public schools coming in, and that was a big issue for the Mennonite people early on in the 20s and 30s. In fact, many of them moved out of the country when the public school system came in, because they were pacifists, so they didn't necessarily fight, they just flight. The whole fight or flight thing.
Yeah.
They would flee to go to another land where they could do what they wanted to do in regards to that. And my dad's parents were part of that group that did that. They went to Mexico, and many Mennonites did, and so there's still a large Mennonite community in Mexico, and there's others in South America, Paraguay, and so on, who very much still. Well, it's changing down there too now. It's not, but in any case, so I went to a public school, but then it had started till grade. It had run teaching until grade 10, and then if you wanted to go higher, you had to do correspondence. But that changed by the time I got to that age, and so at grade 9 we were bused to a neighboring community, but it was still highly Mennonite, right? Still, but not entirely. There we met up with people who were from other European. They had other European roots, like a lot of English people, and Eastern European people from.
Lots of Ukrainians were.
There were Ukrainians there. There were other groups, and so, but still largely Mennonite. But by then, the Mennonite community wasn't quite as there wasn't as much solidarity among Mennonites by that time, because our largest city, which wasn't a very large city, was Swift Current, and in Swift Current there were lots of Mennonites that went to Swift Current for services, for food, for groceries, things like that. But there were many other people there, a lot of English people, Swedish people, German people. Actually,
there's a lot of immigrants.
Lots of immigrants there, but it was a lot of English people in Swift Current. So yeah, to get back to your question, yeah, it was a not really a culture shock so much, although that was involved, but just making that change from a very sort of close-knit community, and having done everything within that community, even our education, and then moving to another place where there were new people you didn't know. Even though it was only 10 miles away, there was people bussed in from all over. It was a central place, so people were bussed in from other communities around. So there were kids there that would have grown up, 25 miles from where we lived. I mean, that sounds like not very much now, but back then, yeah, you're right. It was a change. It was a.
Because you also grew up you had your own language as well. I know you probably spoke English, but
by then we spoke English.
But you had your own language that was unique to the culture that you came from.
Yes. Yeah, and I grew up learning that language first in my home. Yeah. But my mother was primarily responsible for raising the children in terms of that kind of thing. I learned the skills of agriculture from my father, but my mother raised the children primarily in terms of She taught us our faith, and she was also very interested in learning on a wider scale, just on her own. So she prepared us for English school before we went to English school. So by the time I was in grade 1, we didn't have K back then, but by the time I was in grade 1, I was fluent in English.
Yeah.
But I knew both languages. And I needed the home tongue to communicate with my grandparents, because they weren't as proficient in English. But they learned it too. Well, not my dad's parents so much, but my mother's parents, the ones that we had most to do with. They learned how to speak English. So by the time I was in school, I knew English, but I knew both of those languages.
What do today, what of that upbringing would you say informed your life? Like, what are some key things that being raised in this Mennonite community, what has it taught you? Not even just faith-wise, but lifestyle-wise, and values.
Mm-hmm. One of the primary things that were taught was you learned how to work. You learned how to work, and how to even schedule your time as a very young child. Like, yeah, I would go to school, and my mother was very, very insistent that we do the best possible we could with the education that we were getting. Like, she wanted us to, she had high expectations of what would be on the report card at the end of the quarter. We had to show that we were doing our best, because she was looking ahead to, we needed to be good students. So we worked hard at that, but that didn't relieve too much of the regular duties around the farm. So we had to learn how to use our time. And of course, as children, we often failed at that. We had to be disciplined for that. And my mother was not a high disciplinarian in terms of being harsh or anything like that. She was pretty soft, but she was also very persevering in keeping us on task for whatever it was we were needed to do. And so was my father, but he was much more centered on his role. The roles were quite distinct between my parents. So hard work was one of the values. The other one was learning to honor authority in the community, honoring parents, honoring our grandparents especially.
Why is that? Why was honoring parents and grandparents especially? Why was that important? And why do you think it's important?
Well, it has a lot to do with family cohesiveness. It keeps the family cohesive in terms of just getting along as people, but also there's a strong wisdom element to it. The young would learn from the older, and the older were, and a lot of this wasn't verbalized so much. It was caught. My grandparents had wisdom that we needed, and you need to honor them for the wisdom that they have from living life. They were very important. It was sort of a God-given wisdom that was passed on. And with, another way of, I guess, describing honor is respect, would be one aspect of honor, right? But you would honor them, like as time went on, there was education that they hadn't had, but you would honor them nonetheless, because that's where your roots are. that's how come you are who you are. You need to honor people, the elders in the community. Those your parents, your grandparents, elders in the church, because they have God-given qualities that you need to learn,
and just life experience of
life.
And now that you're also older, you have much more wisdom than you did when you were 20.
Well, I'd like to think so.
I would say you do, yeah.
I like to think so. I mean, I'm pretty aware of my failures and shortcomings, but yeah. So, well, it was it's the fifth commandment in the 10 Commandments: honor your father and mother, and so it was highly regarded. So honor. Some of the other things, honesty. My father, I have to say, was, this isn't really the way to put it, but it might express what I mean. He was honest to a fault. He would, even if honesty might cause him trouble with somebody, because it might deter his upward mobility in his work, he was honest. It was just one of his primary tenets in life, was to always tell the truth, live the truth. He failed at it too, but that was one of the primary things I've learned from him, was to be entirely honest, authentic with your life.
It's an interesting, just even hearing you say, it's an interesting turn of phrase, that we feel like we have to qualify somebody being honest to their bones as a fault.
Well, that's right.
It's a weird. That's weird that we phrase it that way.
It is.
That as though it's a flaw.
Yeah, well,
but the flaw is not with the person; it's the person receiving the honesty, really, because they would use it to their advantage. That's the fault.
Well, yeah. I mean, in any business, including the agricultural business, there were times when either exaggerating your story or exaggerating the quality of the products that you're selling could have short-term gain for you, right?
Yeah.
But that isn't how my father operated. He was also as the agriculture business changed and farms got larger, and families in the Mennonite community weren't able to all stay in the business, because it seemed like the whole agricultural scene, the whole culture, almost required you to get bigger in order to make it. He always talked about greed. Greed was not what would in the end be positive for anybody. And I remember when tractors, there was a sea change in terms of the size of machinery that was developed, which would allow you to farm more acres with less equipment. And he when the 4-wheel drive tractor came out, which exponentially changed the size of the machine, more horsepower, and he said, this is not good, because farmers will want to match the amount of land that they have to the tractor that they can buy, which means that they will need more land, and consequently there will be some others who will have to or who will want to sell their land for a higher price in order that this guy can get bigger, which means the farming community will be disrupted. The community will become smaller, and the farms will become larger. And so he says it promotes greed. He says that's not what I want.
It's really interesting because the way you are talking about the structure of what your dad saw in the farming industry is exactly what I've been talking about in the games industry. It's the same concept, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bigger, more powerful engines, games getting massive and so expensive. They're trying to mine as much money out of it. And all these smaller places being bought up, consumed by this entity. And what's at the bottom of it? And we're seeing a full collapse now in this games industry because of what your dad rightfully called out as greed taking over. And it's interesting, you know, he's been gone a few decades now, and he was right.
Yeah. You know, on balance, however, the Mennonites people, as well as many others in the larger community, they were all very entrepreneurial in the sense that they were they wanted to retain their independence. They were not looking for government money or anything like that. They were very independent in terms of providing for themselves. But in the early days, at least, they were also very conscious of bringing the whole community with them, so that, you know, everybody that was involved, if they wanted to, could prosper. So in that sense, you know, and how they ran their animal herds and did their farming, they tried to make improvements on that. But when it came to land use, there was a change when the technology was such that you could grow your farm much larger, and my grandfather did that too. He expanded the farm beyond the actual territory that the Mennonites had homesteaded. My grandfather went beyond Mennonite country to buy property so that he could set all of his kids up to farm if they wanted to, given the fact that there was limited land within the Mennonite group. So he did the same. He went beyond. That's why we ended up eventually at Shaunavon, outside of the Swift Current Mennonite community.
What do you think? I mean, the community, for, I guess, all intents and purposes, that the way you grew up with it, that's gone.
That's pretty much gone.
What do you think caused that?
Well, the Mennonites eventually melted into the wider culture.
Yeah.
Which is not all bad. It's probably inevitable that you would melt into the wider culture to become more part of the sort of national life of Canada, you know. Even though that wasn't really part of their history. They had migrated from Europe to Eastern Europe to, like, my ancestors migrated from northern Germany, Poland, and then to the steppes of the Ukraine, invited by Catherine the Great because Mennonites were known to be good agriculturalists, good farmers, to prove up the Ukraine, along with the Ukrainians, to farm the steppes of that part of the world. And then when there was trouble, then they, in persecution in that part of the world, they moved to Canada and other places, America. moved to other places, and that's how we ended up in Canada. But so they've always moved when there was trouble. They would move on.
So I guess that's where that comes from for me. It's that Mennonite. It's the Mennonite itch. There's trouble, I gotta go.
Yeah, they were pacifists, so they did not stay and fight. It was flight, and that there's a downside to that for sure. But that's what they were like. But eventually, they actually during my time, the Mennonite community started to disperse into the wider culture and become part of the wider world. Even though there was, through the church, there was still some cohesion left. But the agricultural community, as it had been when I was very young, changed to incorporate other peoples coming into our community, and Mennonites moving into other parts of the province.
Which is what you did. You left home. I guess we can move into the next era of your life where you left home to go to school.
Yeah.
And what was that change like for you, leaving the family farm behind to pursue the next phase of your life?
Well, it was exciting in one sense, but it was also a challenge to do so. And then I guess there's other things that motivated moving away. I could have stayed to farm, take on the family farm, but times were tougher on the farm back then, and there was also family conflict that was not fully resolved, and the whole wider world, having attended high school out of the community, you began to be influenced by the wider world and wanting to learn more about the world, and consequently making a life that was more in line with what the culture was doing, even though faith was always at the background of it, retaining the faith. And all Mennonites were confronted with this. Are we going to stay insular, or are we going to move into the wider culture, and from a faith point of view, perhaps influence the culture in terms of what we have learned to know about God, influencing that wider culture with our faith too. And so, there was a big movement of that happening, and it was happening among other groups too.
So you were kind of, in a sense, a pioneer of that era in some ways, with like leaving and this change in your not just in your own family but in your culture. You were part of the ones that went out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could call us pioneers of a sort. I don't know if I ever viewed myself that way. It was just a matter of engaging the wider world for its opportunities, right?
What did you see? Well, when you were looking at those opportunities, what did that represent to you?
Well, I was always interested in learning more. I was interested in education, in learning things that were available in the world, and of course the whole world was changing in terms of that. Like going to a school of higher learning was what people aspired to do for different kinds of work. If there was a lot of Mennonites who were not whose personality didn't really fit into that very quite narrow lifestyle that Mennonites had. Agriculture wasn't the only thing out there, and why can't I pursue something else? And so all of that became part of it. We started to see the wider world and it's all its opportunities. So young people who didn't have an aptitude for agriculture. They weren't particularly interested in it. They learned a lot of values through this tight relational community, for sure. And so when you do that, you are also giving up something, right? That environment where you learn those, I would say, positive values, aren't as easily. You're also confronted with values that if you engage the wider world, that are, I'd say, contrary to the values that you learned. So it makes you much more, you're more vulnerable, but you have to work harder at retaining those values in the.
And you found that to be true?
Oh yeah, I did find that to be true. Yes. I was confronted with a different worldviews. A whole worldview chain, other worldviews present out there that did not include God,
which was totally new to you.
It was, yeah. I'm not sure I fully understood the extent of it, but I did feel it that these people don't believe in God. Some of the values were still the same.
Sure.
I mean, the Christian worldview influence from the past was still there, but somehow God was left out of it now. And there were the shifts in the worldview of others where just plain utilitarianism took over from, say, for instance, my father's thing with being satisfied and humble about what God had provided for us to sustain our family. And so, and this penchant for not being greedy, for being satisfied with what you had, and you can make a living. Dad always made a decent living on a fairly small piece of land, right? But now there was opportunity to make more money just for the sake of it.
Yeah, which is what's the point? Why? What's the purpose?
What's the purpose? Yeah. So for just so you'd be buying into a worldview where more money, more material assets would potentially give you more pleasure,
right?
At that stage in my life, I didn't fully comprehend that. But now looking back, I see, it didn't take till now to see it, but so you're confronted with other ways of viewing the world.
But you had a good foundation set by not just your community, but your dad.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, my parents, who, and not to go into detail about this, but my parents had trouble in their marriage. They were, on one level, my especially for my siblings, I was the oldest one in the family. So I actually had some benefits that the other siblings of mine didn't have, because in the early years of Mom and Dad's marriage, there was much more, even though they weren't fully compatible, I guess, but they worked through their issues better, or they just lived with each other they were congenial. But as their marriage carried on, some of the ways in which each one looked at life was different, and conflict arose between them, and so the marriage somewhat became dysfunctional, and somewhat fairly dysfunctional, and so that was part of it too. But then at that point, the community was not as cohesive.
So it was emblematic of a greater issue almost.
Yeah, emblematic of a greater issue. And at one level, there was things in the community that were not properly discussed either. Things that the culture was confronting them with, that they were not dealing with. Because I think partly because of this flight attitude, which they no longer wanted to do. They didn't want to flee the country anymore because materially they were prospering, but sometimes at the expense of discussing the values issues that were being compromised by being part of the larger culture too. I mean, it's good to be part of the larger culture, but you still want to retain the values that you're living by. And those were being challenged, you know.
So both at home, but then also when you left to go, you moved to Winnipeg, correct?
Oh, yeah, personally.
Which was, I don't know, it's about 10 hours away from where you grew up.
Yeah.
It's not insignificant, especially at that time.
No, it wasn't.
And also a big city.
Yeah, big city, yeah. So there was... it was exciting on one hand to be, as a young person, engaging the world, but it was also difficult in many ways to retain the values that you grew up with, because the values that were present weren't always the same as what we grew up with.
Did you ever find, because, well, obviously you know my story, but did you ever find a time where you questioned if those values really were meaningful, or did you ever have these are just old-fashioned? Did you ever have that kind of questioning? Maybe I'll just throw this all out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, lots of times of doubt about things, that how we lived life back in the day, values-wise. To what extent should we become so material goods? Are they actually that important? Or did we actually miss out? You know, did our generation actually miss out because of, you know? So yeah, you're confronted with questions of life that at the heart of it go right to the heart of it. You know, I mean, yeah, for sure. That was all part of it. It was all part of engaging the wider world. There was also other things happening. There was corruption there. I could see it in the places where I worked, where things weren't as rosy underneath. You know, the company that I worked for in Winnipeg was trying to stay afloat in the aircraft business, and
you're a mechanic, right, or an engineer?
No, I was an engineering technologist. Yeah, so I was involved in basically the welding field, welding quality control and things like that. But there was a lot of stuff that even we could see on the ground in terms of, having to deal with competition for contracts that we were seeking as a company. It would actually get to the floor of the shop, where guys would talk about it. The company right next door was competing for some of the jobs that our company wanted to do. And it was, a lot of trash talk going on, even on the shop floor. Well, that's not fair and all of that stuff. And I don't know how much was actually true on the shop floor. I mean, it was a company of 500 employees. So what did we actually know what the bosses were talking about? But anyway, and some of that stuff was disturbing. I wasn't used to trash talk,
That wasn't something that happened.
That wasn't something I was never allowed to talk like that to my friends or anything.
What was instead? What was encouraged?
Well,
if you had a beef with somebody, or
Yeah, and I'm not saying it didn't happen.
Sure,
It
but it was
happened.
discouraged.
It was discouraged. Like you don't talk about others like that. You respect other people, and you're kind to them. It was all part of, that big word love. Which was taught. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Sure.
Don't do unto others what you wouldn't want them to do to you.
Yeah.
The golden rule. And of course, prefaced by that was love the Lord your God. And so, trash talking somebody else, that wasn't something I grew up with.
And how did it make you feel when you were in this environment?
It felt uncomfortable, and it came to be. It sometimes felt threatening and intimidating. There's one value that I think I mentioned it to you yesterday. One value that was the most challenging for me, and it's still a challenge for me personally. Say in my first job in Winnipeg was starting to understand these different views of the world and how people operate within that, and then doing things that denigrate the competition or denigrate somebody else at an adult level. I mean, we did that as kids.
Yeah, but
if the word would get out as a kid, if you were
trash talking,
if you were doing something negative toward another student, in those days, the teachers, the authorities in the classroom would, if that became a real problem, your parents would hear about it. And in those days, you, as parents, you would not challenge the teacher. You would challenge your child,
right? Because
the teacher was a figure of integrity,
trusted authority.
Trusted authority. They were trusted, and in most cases they were trustworthy. There was exceptions, and so if that got home, it wasn't like going to the teacher and saying, "How come you told my kid that?" No, the kid had to be disciplined, right? Yeah. And so
this is what needed to happen at your workplace.
This is what, yeah, in my view, that's what. But what I always struggled with was the courage to speak up in terms of what I was taught to do. What I was taught is being directly confronted by something that I think is wrong, but to have the courage to stand up and say something. That's always been a struggle, and it's partly to do with my upbringing.
Okay.
Flight instead of fight.
Sure.
No, I'm not, that's a colloquial thing. I mean, it's not like you have to fight, but
stand up,
stand
your ground,
stand up for the right. I knew what the right was, but to have the courage to stand up to it in the midst, and you felt like a minority. You felt, nobody else was doing it either necessarily, right? So to stand up and be the only one doing it, at least to start with, who knows who would have followed? But
what were you afraid of?
Afraid of being alone, afraid of being the only one, afraid of being mocked. There's all kinds of fear that you were conjuring up in terms of standing on, and you didn't want to be unpleasing to people around you. That was another value, right? You want to be congenial with others.
Yeah, and that works in an environment where everyone agrees to that value system.
Well, exactly.
Works great.
Yeah.
But not so great when people just go, "Well, you're weak.
Yeah.
You're going to tell the truth again to a fault. oh, that's weakness. I can manipulate that.
Yeah.
That then
Yeah.
then those values come under fire. And
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
actually, I don't think it makes them any less true.
No.
It makes it vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think I had very much like you in your workplace. I've talked about it on this podcast. What I went through is quite similar,
Mm-hmm.
that atmosphere. I guess this is a tale as old as time then. It just keeps repeating.
It really is. It really is. So what I've come to, the two words or the sort of phrase that I think is important for us in this day is to tell and live the truth in love, and that sometimes will require standing up, because not standing up for what's good or standing against what is evil. Now you have to define those two, what's evil and what's good in a given circumstance. But it's not always it doesn't always look like the loving thing to do, to stand up and resist somebody, or resist an idea that somebody's holding, and to do it in love nonetheless, in kindness, with the good of the other in mind still. That's a tough thing to do, but I think that's important to do in our culture, where we see a lot of things that are not right.
Well, we've been talking about this actually a bit since you've been here, because it's come up in a few different instances of love and accountability.
Mm-hmm.
This is a tough question.
Mm-hmm.
In my last episode, we've talked about that particular friend. A lot.
Yeah.
And even in, things that we're going through in my immediate family as well. It's really tough to find that delicate balance of loving someone, but also holding them accountable for bad ideas or bad behavior. And I'm thinking about it,
Yeah. And there's always this, you really have to check your motives when you run up against something that needs to be confronted. You really have to check your motives in terms of, are you still primarily concerned, or at least equally concerned, with the good of the one that's being confronted?
That's tough.
That's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah.
And to check to make sure this is not something that you're doing somehow for your benefit, although it may be, but primarily you're concerned about that person and actually doing something that's good for them, even though they won't feel like it is, because maybe of false perceptions or whatever. And of course, that doesn't make you don't want to be in judgment of them for the sake of it. You want their best interests in mind. And especially if you're doing this with others who feel the same way, that gives some credence to the fact that you might be right about this.
Yeah.
And this person needs a correction. And so that's a tough balance.
And requires courage.
It requires courage. And that's the one thing, quite honestly, I've suffered with through my life, is having the courage. I can feel pretty strongly about something, and easy to talk about in people of like-mindedness. But when you're dealing with a person who isn't like-minded about it, in fact needs correction, even as a result of a consensus, not just your idea, but we talked about the friends that you have that feel the same way. That gives good credence to the fact that you're probably right. And that's courage.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, since we've been talking about it, since you've been here, I have an instinct, but it does require a courageous step.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's always risk involved with a courageous step, or else it's not required. If there's no risk, then what are you afraid of?
Yeah, exactly. That's true. Yeah, there is a risk involved. But we need to be willing to take risks for the better good.
Yeah, and I mean, I see it in your life too. I think you've also taken risks throughout your life. You've shown courage. When we were young, well, first of all, you moved after all that, saying you went to university and got your degree, and then you worked. You ended up going back to farming.
Yeah.
With your dad.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
That's I would say, a courageous thing to do that. Or would you disagree? Or were you fleeing? Were you fleeing the city?
Well, I can't say there was aspects of the city that were wonderful. Friends we'd made and the church we were involved in. I didn't particularly enjoy my work that much. So I was looking for a change in terms of my work. But my first step towards changing was actually looking at other places in the city to change to. But then the opportunity came to go back to the farm, and whether that was that's a good question. Was I fleeing?
Returning to the familiar.
Returning to the familiar, although it was no longer the familiar that I was raised in. It was quite different. But I had always enjoyed agriculture. It wasn't like, in fact, I've often told people, instead of moving to a post-secondary education that involved engineering, I think I needed some counsel at that stage, which I didn't get, or didn't probably seek either. I would have been better to take post-secondary in the agricultural field, because it turned out I think that was more interesting to me than what I did. What I did end up choosing engineering as going to the engineering instead of to the agro, and those two are often competing at the U of S anyway, the agros and the engineers. But that's another story. Mm. But I think my aptitude would have been closer to the agro side of things, because I did take some education classes while we were farming that I just enjoyed tremendously. So I probably chose the wrong track, but that's another story. So I did have an interest in it, and that drove me to take up my father's proposal.
And you had married Mom at this point already.
Yeah.
Before you were married, what did you think marriage was? Do you remember?
Well, I don't think I was very philosophical about it.
It was very legal, or was it just a change of state?
Yeah, it was. Well, I don't know. I fell in love with this woman. A very human thing, I think.
Yeah.
She, yeah. I don't think I was very philosophical about marriage. Like what? I was raised to believe that marriage is something that will happen. Marriage is
part of growing up,
part of becoming an adult, right? Most people get married, and start their own families and so on. So that was definitely right in there in the culture that I grew up in, that this would happen, even though there's another side to it in terms of my particular circumstance with my parents, but I won't go into that now. But yeah, so deep down inside, I wanted to start my As an adult, I wanted to build my own family unit. That was in the background of my head, in my mind, for sure. Other than that, like I say,
Didn't think too much about it.
I probably didn't think enough about it. That's why I say, we grew up after we were married, both of us. We were attracted to each other. I think that was the big thing. I was a more reserved person, and somewhat due to all the circumstance, somewhat of a socially awkward to some degree. During a time when my immediate culture was changing, right? We were, as I said earlier, we were getting pushed out into the world more, right? From the community that I was raised in, and so that produced social awkwardness, because you don't necessarily know how to behave in the wider world, right?
Yeah. What's the value system that holds this group of people together?
Yeah. And I wasn't outgoing. I wasn't outgoing. I was more inward in a lot of things, and but my wife, your mother, was socially with it. Like, she was outgoing, and she lived in the city, small city, very small city, but still, a city where there was much more going on socially, right? And that was I needed that. A bit of a challenge to your masculinity, though.
How so?
Well, because where I grew up, males gave leadership to their families. It was the male that gave leadership, at least the overt side of leadership. My mother had a lot of influence on how our family operated.
Right.
She was the neck that turned the head. The phrase.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, she had a lot of because she was actually more. She thought about her family more than Dad did in terms of raising us. When we got to be teenagers, we soon realized that there was a lot of her personal baggage that got in the way of actually letting us flower beyond the age in which she was responsible for us. Yeah. For her to let us grow wings and leave was tremendously difficult for her. In fact, that's where a lot of the tensions came from, right? Which actually propelled me, to get back to your earlier question, propelled me to leave home, because I felt too restricted by my mother. She didn't allow us to move out. She liked her role as a parent of her children, and couldn't release us, partly because she probably wasn't receiving from her husband what she needed as a woman. It was part of it.
Compassion, care, investment,
and
affection.
Just affection, just a relationship with Dad that would give her what she needed in terms of support, in terms of love, in terms of affection, in terms of living a life together between the two of them. That was somewhat missing, and so she received that actually from her children. Her children gave her the meaning in her life, right? And then to let us go and join somebody else, right, it's difficult for her. Yeah. But anyway, so.
Well, to what you were saying before about how having mom being very social and you were being more reserved, you said you felt it challenged your masculinity.
Well, okay, it did, because she sort of became, in many ways, the driving force in our marriage to start with. where her friends became my friends. You know, where she would determine socially what we should do next, or who we should know, or who we should invite, and so it was sort of a challenge to the leadership that I had learned to grow in, which was male leadership. Even though, at least my dad was the overt leader of the family when we met the larger community.
Right.
Then he was the leader, even though at home my mother was the one that nurtured us, that raised us, that, she was actually the true leader of us as children, right? But I viewed my father still as the leader of the family when we hit the socials, the
outside the walls of your home.
Exactly. Yeah. And even inside the home he still was in many ways when it came to discipline and things like that. But yeah, so that was how I grew up.
So how did you reconcile that? Was there a period of resentment, or was there tension because of this?
Yeah.
And how did you reconcile it?
There was tension because of it. And sometimes we, being somewhat immature and, quite immature in the early years, that resentment would just boil underneath, right? And you wouldn't even know how to talk about it. Like, I wouldn't even
Didn't have the language.
Didn't have the language to actually discuss it, right? Didn't have the skills to do it. And so that was all a long learning process. And so we had lots of tough events, tough confrontations in our marriage. Sometimes we would have them without actually dealing with the actual issue.
You just raised them.
We just felt, both of us often would feel that something was wrong, and then you know how that can easily
becomes a ghost in the room.
It becomes the elephant in the room that we actually don't deal with. We just fight.
Yeah.
Right.
It's the topic, not the source.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It could be something particular that triggered something that we would then fight about, not the real issue of why we were triggered in the first place.
Yeah.
And so that took a lot of time to do. And so our personalities are still the same, but I think we've both realized that issue, and I think we're much more mutual about things now, even though in many cases she will see things that I'm not seeing and raise it.
And I think that's kind of the beauty of when you've created that language, right? It's like we have those I find that the same with my wife, and I feel she sees things in me that I'm blind to, and it's a great way of staying humble. You have to they see the world differently, but they know you, and they know when you're acting weird or acting strange, and they can call out those behaviors. It's one of the beauties of working through the tough times. I think we do quit too early nowadays. But there's certain things that if you can push past even the hardest points, there's a new level that you achieve of understanding and wisdom with each other that benefits both your lives. That's impossible alone.
Absolutely. So earlier, one of your first questions here was, referring to a statement that I had made about we've had many marriages. Well, one of them was when we actually came to grips with the actual problem in this case, right? That was just another critical point in our marriage where we started to understand our individual person. Well, subconsciously we understood our
but it was an intellectual exercise.
It was an intellectual exercise to actually use the words to describe how we are different.
Yeah.
Right? That and that was a
new moment. It's
a new moment.
Yeah.
It wasn't a point in time. It was over a period of time, but you still come to the understanding of how you're different and how you then better incorporate the differences and make them positive in your marriage. It's not negative. I mean,
No.
two people that think the same all the time about everything is not healthy either, right?
No. Or the expectation that the other person does, which does happen too.
Yeah, exactly.
Or the assumption even sometimes.
Yeah, and being humble enough to understand, or to view it, being humble enough to realize that she has gifts I don't have, and I have gifts she doesn't have.
Yeah.
It's not like I have to be the master of everything, and she has to, tally ho every, she she has as much to contribute as I do, and as the leader of the home, if you want to put it that way, it's to both of our benefits to understand what we each bring.
You obviously had kids.
Yeah.
At some point. What was well, first we'll talk about my older sister. I don't mention names generally, so we'll kind of keep it there, but you had a daughter.
Yeah.
Who's my older sister.
Yeah.
What was that moment like, and how did that shift your perspective, or did it?
Like simply having the first child?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bringing a new entity, child, into your home that is of your creation, and going, this is life now.
Yeah.
Do you remember those early feelings? And
yeah, some of them. My wife would be your mother would be much more articulate on her feelings than I am about mine. Yeah, I mean, we both wanted children. Changes everything in terms of, not changes, it makes a big change in your life. You're no longer just the two of you and going out whenever you want or doing stuff. You don't need to worry about a child and looking after that child. And so that's all change. That changes things. The child sort of becomes priority in your life, as you know. I think we made the adjustment fairly well in terms of dealing with that, because we both wanted a child. But it still changes. It changes things. You can't just do whatever you want between the two of you. You have to consider the child, which you want to do, but it still impedes certain things. But then you have the blessing of a child, and you in the family you are affirmed, like we were affirmed by the larger family for our first child. We were celebrated because we had our first child. That was all positive. I would say the larger stressor was probably when the second child didn't come along as we anticipated.
Right.
I don't know if you want to go into
Well, I mean, I guess it kind of is a natural move to the next topic, which is me.
Yeah, which is you.
Right. And I was talking to my wife about this. She's also adopted, and I was adopted into your family. And there's this interesting dynamic in the generational aspects of our families, where we have my older sister, who is born to you and mom.
Yeah.
And then I'm adopted, and then I have two more siblings beneath me who are also adopted.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife is also adopted. So there's this interesting lineage of, some of us look like each other and some of us don't. But then now we have a child who looks like us.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing. But I was curious. I don't think I've ever asked you this before. What was it like picking up a child that was not directly yours? Do you remember that moment? Like, that must have been strange. I can't even imagine.
It was certainly different. It was different, but for us, it was very, very exciting. Our daughter coming along was also very exciting. I guess the other thing I should mention about our first child coming along, we had friends who were experiencing the same thing at the same time as, having their first, or maybe in one case their second child. But we were raising children at the same time as in this is in Winnipeg now, where our friends were raising children and having their kids at the same time as we were.
Okay.
And so there was a lot of it kind of bolstered our friendships with these other people, because we were raising our children together,
going through the same thing,
thing, and bouncing off ideas at the same time about how to do this and how to do that better with raising your child. So that was a good thing.
That's interesting, because we didn't have that.
You didn't.
We had our daughter, and we were here in Vancouver, and people would look at us like we were aliens. What are you doing? Why did you do that to yourself? Yeah. And you'd be in a restaurant, people look at you. Are you okay? Did you mean to do that?
Yeah.
Just this weird.
Yeah.
And we didn't have anyone around us here that were having children, so we were very much on our own. So we had a very different experience.
Yeah. And I think the mentality in the culture at the time, like this would have been the 70s, was a little bit different towards family.
I agree.
Family and having kids than it is today.
Yeah.
Kids were still considered something everybody wanted to have.
Yeah.
Today it's not quite the same. Not everybody wants to have children.
You know what they do want to have, though? Money.
Well, they want to have money. Yeah. Yeah. And that's another value that I was raised with, and my wife your mother was as well, was to have children was a positive thing. It was a good thing. You didn't really consider the money.
Right.
I mean, you did, but you didn't. In the sense that money was secondary. I mean, we had children when we were poor.
Right.
We didn't have great...
made it work.
We made it work. We didn't have great jobs. Yeah. And that was sort of, children are something you want to have beyond, at least that was our thinking. We weren't thinking that much about the money. I mean, we were thinking about the money in one sense because we needed more of it. We thought, at least. But so anyway, there's that. But a different time in the culture. But getting back to you coming along, I mean, it was, you were a little over 3 years younger than, it took over 3 years to have our second child. And we were already thinking of a second child after 2 years. That would have been our, I don't know exactly, but sooner than when you did come along. So when you came, I mean, it was, we were overjoyed. We were overjoyed about having you come along. And the whole adoption thing was still was rather new in our family. Again, the dynamics change when you have your second child, because now there's two, and you're also dealing with the older one's attitude to the new one.
Sure.
Right? But we had to deal with the adoption thing with the wider world, because in that sense we were doing something that our friends weren't doing. They had their own biological children. We very seldom think about that part of it anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common question that people ask me. There's some interesting ideas about adoption, that we don't view our family as our family, that it's our adopted family. So there's a categorizational separation somehow in our mind, but that's just not true.
No,
I don't even for a moment consider anything else to be true, that this is my family.
No, it's and it's the same for us, for your mother and I. that just isn't really part of our vocabulary
Yeah.
anymore. It's just not. I mean, when somebody asks a question about it, well, then we're forced to think about it.
Yeah, and you talk about it.
But really, that's just not part of our thinking anymore. You're our children, just like our oldest daughter is our child. It's just not part of where it again sort of hit the fan, so to speak, is when you guys became of age. You were, we had always been entirely open with you about how you came to us and so on. For many of those early years, I don't think that triggered anything particular in you guys. But later, when you got older, you did think about, well, then where did we come from?
Right.
That started to happen. So that part of it, I don't think we had thought about it, but we hadn't thought it through as to what would happen and what were the implications of that, right? And so that was another area that we had to work through when it came. And each one of you responded differently to that question. Yeah. Where did I actually come from? Who are my biological parents? And that kind of a thing, right? It was different for everybody. But, we're past that now. But that was also, something that we had to deal with as parents. And you had to deal with as children.
Yeah. Yeah, I could imagine how scary that would be to, with my own daughter, if she was adopted, to raise her and then one day go, she might want to go somewhere else or choose the parent that gave them birth. That is scary.
Yeah.
There was one thing that has come up that I've thought about a lot. When I was in Sweden, you got really sick.
Oh, yeah.
With COVID. And I think you experienced something pretty profound in that. Well, I mean, you were quite ill, right? You were, and in fact, it was like I remember would I wake up with a call because of the time difference. I was really worried, and it was a dark time, I think. But you afterwards told me that you came away from that experience with kind of a question of what now? And the reason I asked that question is because, I think there's a lot of assumptions about what we as men go through. We talked a lot about your early years and kind of finding your feet, having a family. And, obviously we could be here for hours talking about your career. You were a farmer, you were a teacher, you were a home inspector. You've kind of done a lot of different things. You would think kind of, in the back third, as we talked about yesterday, as you're into retirement, that you kind of have it all figured out. But I think that there's an interesting truth about when you were kind of faced death, I guess. I think we can say that you came out of it with a perspective. Can you talk a bit about what it was like to go through that? And I'm looking very specifically for a male perspective on a brush with death and then coming out the other end, and what that world looked like when you came out, and what questions you had.
Yeah. The situation with COVID was actually the third sort of incident, the third event, if you will, in a sort of a tripartite situation. I don't have a history of dealing with maladies too much. I had asthma, and I think it was sort of occupationally induced. Now, when I look back, I had asthma when I was working on my first job, on my job in Winnipeg. but it was I was working in a lab, and I think it was partially induced by very poor ventilation conditions in the lab that at least exacerbated a problem with my lungs, and I got asthma. So that was the first time I'd ever really confronted illness of any kind. I've never been sick really. But then I was diagnosed with kidney disease in 2003, and it's a very slow digression, a slow disease that doesn't really affect your life in the first years. You're taking medication and so on, but it doesn't hamper your lifestyle until the kidney disease reaches a certain level. Then it starts to affect your life. You don't function the way you should. So that was a precursor to COVID. Like what? Not the diagnosis was long before COVID, 2003. I didn't have COVID till 2021. But the kidney disease, it reached a peak about 2014. It started to reach a peak when I was starting to feel the disease in terms of its influence on my life. I didn't have the energy. I ran out of breath. I had some physical issues. I could still carry on with my work and so on. But there came a time when I had to go on dialysis, which was 2016. And I was on dialysis for 3 years and 8 months before I received a kidney for transplant. And that was, that revolutionized my life.
I remember.
180 degrees. I was quite sick.
Yeah.
At the end of my dialysis years, and I got the kidney, and I felt like I'd have been before I ever even had.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it just changed. It was 180 degrees. But before that, I'd already had to have surgery to remove one kidney, and so that was a more serious surgery. So I actually had 3 surgeries in close proximity to each other. The kidney removal, then the kidney transplant almost 2 years later, and then in 2021 I had the COVID. So 3 successive major surgeries or major hospital events in my life. During that time, you begin to think about, forces you to think about your life. Each one of these potentially, the transplant, if it hadn't worked out, I could have had a shorter life, Mm-hmm. And then COVID, that was probably the most life-threatening of all 3 of them. And I, at the time, I didn't even realize how sick I actually was. I was sicker than in my mind I thought I was. During the COVID experience, I was in the hospital for 5 weeks, and in the middle of that somewhere, well, closer to the end, they were almost put me on a ventilator, and I knew about the ventilator. I mean, your mom and I had discussed the ventilator, and for a lot of COVID people who had to go on the ventilator, it saved their life, but it had long-term consequences of having been on the ventilator, even if you made it. And I was kind of aware of that. I never ended up going on the ventilator, and the just hours before I was to go on the ventilator during a particular night, my condition changed so that I did not have to go. That was an emotional time for me, because I felt like I'd been saved from something that would have had huge implications for me, having to go on, well, potentially, and more likely than not, that there would be effects from that. All of those 3 things, those three events, medical events, cause you to look on, reflect on your life. And I was of retirement age during that period. I hadn't retired yet because I was too sick to work. I was on dialysis, but I had another condition developed in my body, restless legs, and I could not sleep. And so I had to quit working, and basically I retired. I wrote all of my clients that I was done. I was finished. I was too not healthy enough to work.
Do you look on that as a failure? How do you look at that moment where you had to stop working, which is something that I think men, we take quite seriously when it comes to identity, and say, I have to quit because I'm unwell enough to move forward?
Yeah, it does somewhat, because my wife was still working. Your mother was still working.
Yeah.
So you're in one sense, although I think I'd come past a lot of that by then, but I was raised and I grew up thinking to a large extent for a lot of time that as a male, I should be the primary breadwinner in the home.
Yeah.
That mentality was there. I should be the one taking the lead in bringing home the bacon, so to speak. And so that, you think about that. On the other side of it, though, I had the other thought, which was, well, I'm actually of retirement age, in relative to what our culture does, right? I was, plus 65 plus. Well, I quit entirely in 2019, when I was approaching 68. And at the back of my mind, I was thinking, I'm going to work till 70. We're not that well set financially that I should quit before the time that I actually need to quit because of my physical health. I should work longer. Why not? I'm healthy, and if I was healthy enough. And the kidney transplant would have allowed me to do that. I could have gone back to work. But the thing is, it was too long. By then, all of the clients needed someone else to do that work. And so I had lost those clients, right? I couldn't really restart. Besides, I had already began the proceedings of shutting the company down. Yeah. Because I couldn't, and at that point, I didn't actually know yet when I'd get the transplant. I was too sick to work. Yeah. And I didn't know how long that would be.
It could be years.
There's no promises on the transplant as to when it would come. As it turned out, it came shortly. I quit my job in January of 2019, and in December of 2019, I received the kidney. Yeah. Right? Yeah. It was too late to rejoin that profession. I would have had to, which means that I wouldn't be able to likely get work that would provide the same amount of remuneration, And so I didn't work till 70. I only worked till just under 68 years old. But yeah, you do think about what now as a male? That I'm not the breadwinner anymore. Mm-hmm. Although by then I knew that there was much more to the male enterprise than that. It's just being the... Well...
I would say that, and not to derail too much, but I think I've seen that in you over the years. When I was younger, I don't think we really saw eye to eye on much, when I was the weird arty kid and you were more of the kind of the logical, and you would we had a very different way of seeing the world. And I think I think when you were going through these, you were changing your perspective on what it means to be probably a dad or a husband. I benefited from that because I was going through a tough time, which I've talked about in this show before, about going through a divorce and having questions about, what should one expect in a marriage? And these are some troubles I'm having. You were actually the main person that I went to with my troubles at that time, which was kind of strange because we hadn't really built a relationship before that. And it really was, I think, the start of what I consider one of my greatest friendships between us. And I think that happened because you started to change the way you thought about what it was to be, because we weirdly connect quite deeply, not maybe on a interest level, the things that we're interested in some cases, but I think it's more what's important to us and how we see the world. And we talk about philosophy and faith and these things that really matter, that layer too, so I mean, I've benefited from that journey, and I think it's so important. If you were to have remained the same guy you were when you were 20 or 30, we would have probably missed out on the richness of this. And I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah. And getting back to an earlier topic here in our discussion, I've always had an interest in the academic side of life, the intellectual side of life. Even back in my high school years, I actually loved to learn. Kids would come back from their summer holidays and they'd say, "Oh, we're back at school." I never really felt that.
I did, so we were very different that way.
Well, maybe. I actually enjoyed school. I mean, not always, but generally speaking, I enjoyed school. And so, and when it came to post-secondary, I looked forward to it as well because I enjoyed learning. But the real point I want to make here is it was through the post-secondary educational process that I realized that I was interested in the deeper things in life, philosophically, theologically. I was interested in learning from the deep thinkers of the past, just as much as I was in learning about agriculture or engineering.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I kind of have both those sides in my aptitude or my giftedness or my talents. I like to work with my hands, but I like to work with my head, my mind, my heart. Both sides are part. The only thing is, the issue with that is that because you have sort of a wider interest in things, the arts is something that I never really did have an interest in. I've gained an appreciation for it now, largely because of what you're doing. I understand when you showed me all this stuff the other day about what you're working on right now, it is absolutely incredible, but it would be nothing that I could ever do.
Right.
Not in my mind. I mean, you've just got something there that it looks terribly complex to me.
Well, we should have that talk someday. That what I do is actually, a lot of people think it's wild imagination, but it's actually scientific. It's a scientific method.
I suppose
of building foundations, but we won't get into that.
Yeah. And there's a lot that you can contribute by the outcomes of what you're doing. But I never really had an appreciation for that.
But I think I had something similar, but I came through it the same kind of way you did through a formal education. I came through it in the arts, but it kind of ends in the same questions. What's this for?
Yeah.
Why is art important? Why is philosophy important? What does it matter?
Yeah.
Which obviously led to what I'm doing with this show as well.
And you don't have to gain expertise in philosophy and even in theology or any of those higher thinking kinds of professions by doing everything formally.
Right. I agree.
It's just that for me, I probably needed it because it would kind of discipline my life to do it. without being distracted from the on the other side of my life, which is being the hands-on kind of guy, right?
Yeah.
So I needed more discipline to stick with something, and I still look at it to this day that I'm kind of a not a jack of all trades, but a jack of all kinds of stuff. But I'm not really a master of anything. Sometimes I've been too distracted from one by the other, right?
I could see that in your
without
life. Yeah.
without focusing in on one, making the decision to focus on one or two, and that's been kind of an issue on one hand. But then on the other hand, I guess there's some benefit to being somebody who knows a little bit about everything, or not everything, but whatever it is I know about a little bit. So there's that. But
so with understanding that part of your personality where you feel you never mastered something, but you've kind of spread your knowledge wide into various what when you came out of that experience with COVID where you felt you're saved from it, and you came out the other end and you left the hospital, you were left with a pretty profound question.
And initially I was tremendously exhilarated by the fact that I came out of it,
because there was a point where you felt you might not.
Well, I was told I might not have. I felt really sick, but I actually never gave up on thinking I'd be out. I'd be coming out of it. But it was a thought in the background. And then towards the end of it, when I was recovering, still in hospital, with conversations with the people that had treated me and your mother as well, who was totally up on what I was into. In fact, she advocated for me during that process so that I got the best care possible. She advocated.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, I can't really thank her enough, because she did intervene at key points to kind of, at a couple of points, she actually met alongside the medical team when they were talking about what the next step was.
Wow.
She managed to get in on that discussion.
Only Mom could do that.
Well, exactly. and at the time, I didn't even know it. But then when I was in recovery mode in the hospital, that's when it really, and I realized how sick I'd been. I didn't even, I never, in the back, I never gave up on life. Not at all. I'm pretty sure I'd recover from this, but part of it was because I didn't realize how sick I was. And knowing all of that and then coming home was tremendously exhilarating. I felt like God had really answered my prayer and my prayers and other people's prayers on my behalf. But then the next step, right? God, you've taken me through this, and I've come out the other end. I'm the age that I am. I'm nearing 70. What next? I'm not going back to my job. If I do go back to work, it'll have to be something else. What next? What? I think it's partly a question that every retiree has to answer.
Sure.
Right?
It's the next phase.
Yeah. But in my case, I felt like I had come through something pretty substantial, which allowed me to live, which kind of made what I was going to do now more significant. Like, if it's God that's brought me through here, what does he have for me now? Then it must be something significant, because he saved my life. Right? And so what next? I guess that question has been partially answered. but not actually entirely. I mean, I'm still kind of looking for something that I haven't found yet. I mean, it's not like a matter of filling your time. There's
not as simple as that.
No, I mean, I fill my time, but it doesn't necessarily feel like I'm doing something that I should be doing. I don't really feel a call. Let's put it. I've had calls before in my life, right, where I knew I needed to do whatever I needed to do, but I don't really feel that call right now. I have a lot of interests, but this time I want to be a little more focused.
A little more courage.
Well, it probably will take courage. Yeah, I want more courage. I'm still working on that too. You know, I have to be honest.
We all are.
I'm 73 years old, but there's still things I need to work on. So I want to be a little more focused. Not that there wouldn't be more than one thing I'd be doing, but something that's preeminent, that's primary. Yeah. I'm still looking for that. I'm not sure. I tend to want to go back on to things that I've already done, in which I could continue to pursue, teach, or I'm not actually leaning towards. I'm not leaning towards something to do something with my hands. I'm not leaning towards that. I could, but I don't have as much interest in it as something more spiritual, something more, what's the word for it?
Meaningful?
Sorry?
Something more meaningful?
Well, it would be more meaningful.
A higher calling,
Yeah, it's something that involves men, maybe women, and their minds and hearts. Something, I don't know, what's the word for it?
I mean, that's mentorship, teaching at level 2, as I would call it.
Yeah, it could be teaching, it could be mentoring, it could be just influencing in some way.
If you start a TikTok, Dad, I might have to stop you.
Yeah, well, you know how I might be into TikTok. It's not part of my life. So, what would it be? I still love to study. I love
learn more.
I love to study, but just to study for the sake of it, I don't think. There was a time in my life when I needed to study for the sake of it to prepare me for something else. Mm-hmm. I couldn't teach unless I studied.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting. You're in this phase where you have questions, and study is something done for self to eventually share. Yeah. But I wonder. Here's my suggestion. Right?
Okay.
Unfiltered. I think you're a great teacher, and you've been pretty foundational to, I would say, my journey as a man. And I think the whole point of this podcast is for men who are struggling for identity. It's a real problem. I think we can see it in our family, in our community. There's probably not enough time in the world. And I wonder, when you gave that speech at the anniversary as well, I don't think you recognize it because that's not in your nature or your character, but everybody in that room was looking to you as a man of wisdom. And it really made an impact on me. And I think you have, just even in this conversation, I think you have a lot of knowledge and wisdom to share. And you talked about this at the beginning, about how in your culture that you came from, that was really important, that the wisdom was passed on by the elder generation. And that's broken in our time. In fact, we denigrate and mock elders in our society. and I think to our great disadvantage. So that would be, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe, that speech at our wedding anniversary, I didn't really view that as a very well.
Well, I know that's because that's your nature, Dad.
I came away thinking, I didn't prepare well enough for that. I should have done better.
Yeah, well, that's also in your personality.
Well, I guess so, but anyway, I'm glad it did what it did. I mean, I've had other people tell me that, and I thought, boy, I didn't feel that way about it. But anyways, yeah, it's a good thing to think about. And I guess the next, like I say, I still love to study. I still love to learn. But again, I don't want it to stay here with me. Yeah, it's self-edifying, but I want to be able to pass it on. I want to be able to share that then with somebody.
I think it's a good transition point to my last question. What does legacy mean to you? To
me? Well, legacy, by definition is it involves, first of all, what you've been able to learn. Maybe you could use the word accomplish. I don't know if that's the right word, but what life has taught you, or what life has provided for you, and you're leaving that now, or you want to leave that with the ones that come after you. That's how I view legacy. I don't know if that's a dictionary definition, but
pretty close, I think.
Yeah. But for me, often legacy is looked at as what's in my will in regards
material.
to my material assets that I've collected. That will not be my legacy. I have virtually no material assets to pass on.
Now you tell me.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You might have been able to use it. I don't know. And if I had it, I'd give it to you. But in fact, I want to give it to you now if I had it. But I don't necessarily have much of that. So my legacy is going to be immaterial. It'll be the place, or at least where we started the interview, which was with values. Yeah. Life values. That's what I want to pass on. And many of them are not ones that I've conquered or that are have fully reached their potential in my life. But they're values that I hold to, even though I still fail at them, at incorporating them fully. But that's what I want to pass on. Values, and also maybe it's being too strident, but I want to pass on wisdom for living.
Yeah.
Wisdom for the future, wisdom for what's eternal. That's what I would like my legacy to be. How can I best pass that on? That's the question. How can I best? I mean, if that is the legacy, then at my age, some of that should already have been passed on, right? Through my life. It should already have been.
Do you see it?
Well, yeah, I do see some of it. Yeah, I do. I'm not, I want to be very humble about that, because anything I've learned, very little of it has ever originated with me.
It comes from something before.
It comes from something that's influenced me. It's never sourced in me. It's just something that I've taken and tried to live out in my own life, and want to pass on to others. It's a passing on kind of a thing, right? It's you know what I mean? It's not sourced in me. It's sourced in either the history of my family, or it's sourced in God. It's passed down to me, and I've tried to incorporate it, and then want to sort of pass it on, either by my life, or if I'm a teacher in the last years of my life, through talking about it, through teaching it, or if it was to be a mentorship thing, it would be through just talking about it, that kind of thing. That's what I'd like my legacy to be. And another sort of sub category here is I'd like our marriage, my wife and I, together, because a lot of my thinking, my values have been enhanced by her. I want to give her full credit. They've been enhanced by her, and this is over and above the fact that she has, through the experience that we just talked about, the COVID experience, where she had a large hand in just saving my life. Not directly, but through her influence on, and the advantage I had there was that she knows the on the ground stuff that happens in the medical profession, so that she doesn't know all the high-minded stuff, but she knows the practical outworkings of a hospital, which was really helpful. So there's that. But
to the from my perspective, the legacy, I think you've done an incredible job, and everything, even though I went through a pretty rough period, I think that still lived in me. I was convicted, I think, in my heart. That's why I drank, because I knew it was wrong. And to pass that on to my daughter, and to see her values alive, I think that's evidence that even what your father and your grandfather did before you carries on in this family line. And even though, we may all look different because we come from different places, we are a family. And I think it carries down, and I think you're well on your way to that legacy if you haven't already achieved most of it.
Well, thank you for those words. I probably often don't think that strongly about it in terms of being a success in that, but
I may have a bias.
you may have a bias. Yeah, you may have. But
if you were to say something to either the younger version of yourself, or to someone, a man in his 20s who's struggling with life, what would you tell him? One thing. You get one thing. Of your time on this earth, what is the most important thing?
Seek the truth in love.
Beautiful.
Be a truth seeker.
I'm on board with that.
And love doesn't fully describe God. God is bigger than love. But the scriptures say God is love. So if you delve into love in its truest form, you're going to reach God.
100%.
You're going to be confronted with God. Then you have to decide. Then you make a decision.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I don't know who there'd probably have to be, if you're talking to somebody only once, then that's what I would say. If you're developing a relationship, or one thing you could say, but if you're developing a relationship with somebody, you might want to build up to that.
Right.
Build up to that statement, right? Because you're kind of hitting hard, but
it's been really great to talk to you, even though there's a mic here. I haven't really noticed it.
No, I kind of forgotten about it. Not fully,
but it's been great to have you here, and I'm sad that you're leaving today, but you can come back anytime.
Yeah, well, we're gonna have lots of conversations. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure.
I hope. Yeah.
All right.
And yeah, I'm just so thankful that you are where you are now.
Me too. I would never have predicted it, but I think that's the beauty of grace. Right? We can all turn it around.
Yeah, and that's true. Absolutely. There's always hope.
All right. Thanks, Dad. Love you.
Okay. Love you too. Very much.